Hey all, it's Ada
And Anna Corinne.
on our executive order, and today we're going to be talking about what we know as of Friday morning about the election results. We'll be going over the Electoral College, unprecedented countrywide results, and Washington state and local results. So what is the Electoral College? The Electoral College is made up of 538 electors, and their votes decide the president and the vice president of the United States. When voters cast their votes, whether mail-in or in person, they are choosing which candidates receive their state's electors. The candidate who received a majority of the electoral votes, 270, wins the presidency. You probably have seen that if you are like me and are constantly refreshing your results on your phone and looking for that 270 number, and you're never getting it the last few days. It'll happen eventually. The number 538 is the sum of the nation's 435 representatives, 100 senators, and 3 electors given to the District of Columbia, which is Washington, D.C. Most states have a winner-takes-all system, meaning that whichever candidate receives the majority of the votes in that state will receive all of the electoral votes from that state. The only exceptions are Maine and Nebraska, which each allocate votes for its congressional districts. As of now, Biden has one of Nebraska's 5 electoral votes, and in Maine, Trump has one of Maine's 4 electoral votes. Choosing the electors in each state is a process that varies from state to state. What commonly happens is that political parties nominate electors at their state conventions. Sometimes that process occurs by vote of the party's central committee. The electors are usually state elected officials, party leaders, or people with strong affiliations with the presidential candidates. In Washington, the political parties generally select the electors through their caucus and convention system, which usually occurs in the spring of the presidential year. If no candidate reaches the magical 270 electoral votes, the election is thrown to the U.S. House of Representatives. Each state then casts one vote, choosing between the 3 top contenders. Whoever wins the majority of states in the House wins the election. It's also important to note that in the Electoral College system, a candidate can lose the popular vote and win the Electoral College vote. This happened to George W. Bush in 2000, who lost the popular vote to Al Gore but won the Electoral College 271 to 266. This also happened in the 2016 election, as Hillary Clinton won the popular vote to Donald Trump, coming at 48% of the popular vote to his 45.9% popular vote. Ultimately, though, Trump won 306 electoral votes to her 232 electoral votes. There's been a lot of dispute as to the effectiveness of the Electoral College, whether or not we as a country should switch to a different electoral system. Some people have called for a pure popular vote. Maine also has tried ranked choice voting this election, which essentially means that voters were given the option to rank the candidates in order of preference. Fun fact, at Western Washington University, we use ranked choice voting for our student government elections, and we've seen that be super effective. And an interesting other fact is that currently Biden has the most of the popular vote. I'm going to toss it over to Anna Corinne now to talk about how unprecedented this election has been, especially during a worldwide pandemic with the increase of mail-in ballots that have been happening. Mail-in ballots are pretty normal to us as Washington state residents, but to the rest of the United States, some people had never heard of them before, and they're definitely making a huge difference in this election.
So, as Ada said, much of this election is extremely unprecedented, which has created some controversy, confusing rhetoric, and conflicting messages. We have also heard questioning regarding the legitimacy of mail-in or absentee voting. As she said, in Washington, this isn't new to us, but countrywide, many states had to adapt their methods of voting in order to accommodate for the pandemic. Due to COVID-19, states have had to adapt their electoral processes to ensure the health and safety of their voters. This means that many states have increased their capacity for mail-in ballots to limit people at the polls for public health safety. While some states have had the infrastructure in place to accommodate for mail-in ballots, like Colorado, Oregon, and Washington, all of which have been using mail-in ballots for years, these states automatically send all registered voters a mail-in ballot. Other states have not relied on mail-in ballots as heavily, but this year have had to make changes. These states can be put into a few different categories regarding absentee ballots and how they send them out. First, there are no excuse mail-in states, and these are states where registered voters can apply for a mail-in ballot, and they do not need an excuse to do so. This includes Arizona, Florida, Georgia, Washington, D.C., and others. Other states require an excuse or a reason when filling out a request for an absentee ballot. For example, in Alabama, one can apply for a mail-in ballot if they are out of state during the election, sick, working longer than 10 hours on polling day, or are a caregiver or incarcerated. Additionally, historically in Delaware, voters were allowed to request to vote by mail if they were out of town, sick, disabled, had a religious commitment, or were a member of the armed services. This year in Delaware, the requirements were shifted and ballots were sent to all registered voters, and they didn't need to submit a request. While many of these states require voters to give a reason for requesting an absentee ballot, states have altered their restrictions due to the pandemic. In Tennessee, for example, the court ruled that absentee voting had to be made available to all voters in 2020. And in West Virginia, the restrictions were lifted as well, and all registered voters were eligible to vote absentee. So as you can see, different states have had different electoral processes, and the pandemic has required all states to be flexible and adapt their voting to accommodate. This can be confusing as each state has its own restrictions and requirements. And quite honestly, this is a form of voter suppression by making it harder for folks to vote rather than easier. It's sometimes difficult to muddle through different states' requirements in order to figure out how to vote. It's also important to note that different states began counting and processing mail-in ballots at different times. For example, Oregon, California, Maine, and others began counting before Election Day, which expedited the counting process and allowed for quicker election results, which we've all been hoping for. Many states such as Washington, Idaho, Nevada, and New York started processing early ballots upon receipt, meaning once the ballots were received. Meanwhile, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Mississippi, and Alabama were the only 4 states in the country that waited until Election Day to begin processing the ballots. And as we've seen, particularly in Pennsylvania, this has slowed the counting process, and we are still, as of Friday the 6th, waiting for results from Pennsylvania. Another major difference between states is whether or not they will accept ballots after Election Day, given that the ballots cast are postmarked by or on Election Day. Some states will accept ballots after Election Day as long as they were postmarked by or on November 3rd. For example, in Washington, ballots are eligible to be accepted up to 20 days after Election Day, November 3rd. California accepts ballots up to 17 days after the election. Pennsylvania, Virginia, Kentucky, Kansas, and others accept ballots up to 3 days after November 3rd. And many states, such as Montana, Colorado, Oregon, and more, require mail-in ballots to arrive on or before Election Day in order to be accepted. So they won't take or accept ballots after November 3rd. As different states have different policies and protocols regarding when to begin processing ballots, as well as whether or not they will accept ballots that are received after the election, these differences and discrepancies have fueled controversy and debate over the legitimacy of this election, as we've heard many attacks coming from President Donald Trump and some other elected officials regarding the legitimacy of this election. We have heard a lot of rhetoric coming from the White House and other elected officials with conflicting messages about the election and mail-in ballots in general. In his speech on Thursday, November 5th, President Trump mentioned several court cases that his administration had filed, as well as the possibility for a case to potentially, in his words, reach the highest court of the land, being the Supreme Court. Early Wednesday morning, the president claimed victory, but he also said, quote, "We'll be going to the U.S. Supreme Court. We want all voting to stop." He has also filed lawsuits in a few states, and some say that this is his way of setting the stage to eventually present a case to the Supreme Court regarding the legitimacy of this election. While there is not a lot we do know regarding these cases, it has been reported that in Michigan, a judge dismissed his campaign lawsuit. In this suit, the campaign aimed to halt the voting, claiming that challengers and observers were not allowed to observe the handling of absentee ballots close enough, but this lawsuit was tossed out. In Georgia, another judge dismissed a Trump lawsuit, and this lawsuit claimed that ineligible ballots were being mixed in with eligible ones and that much of the votes being counted were ineligible or illegal. The president has filed several lawsuits in Pennsylvania to look into challenging ballots based on voter ID laws and procedures. And in Nevada, Trump has claimed that 10,000 votes came from former residents who don't live in Nevada anymore or have forged or false signatures. These claims and cases have incited protests across the country. In Maricopa County, which is in Arizona, the county where Phoenix is, a group of Trump supporters gathered and were shouting, "Count the votes." And in Detroit, Michigan, a group of Trump supporters gathered and were shouting, "Stop the count." At the end of the day, regardless of what political affiliation you may have or what candidate you may or may not have voted for, I think we can all agree that this election has been fairly tumultuous and confusing. It can seem like there are a lot of different messages coming from President Trump, different supporters, and this can be seen in the news, media sources, social media, and from different elected officials on both sides of the aisle. One overall message, though, has just been to maintain patience throughout this week and likely for a while to come as results come in, recounts happen in various states, and we just wait for a clearer understanding of what is to come. Hey everyone, it's Anna Corinne, and I am editing this podcast on Monday, November 9th, and I just wanted to hop on and give a few updates. Because Adah and I recorded this podcast on Friday, late in the morning, there was a lot we did not know in terms of the presidential race, and like most of us, we were constantly checking the news, refreshing that Google page, trying to figure out who would be our next president and vice president-elect. But on Saturday morning, we all woke up to some news as different media sources projected Joe Biden and Kamala Harris as our next president and vice president-elect. So now we have a clear sense of who will be our next president and vice president of the United States. They both addressed the nation in a speech on Saturday night, and we will link a video to that speech in our bio. I think we all have a clear sense of what is to come, but we have not seen President Donald Trump concede yet, and we are seeing continuing rhetoric from some GOP officials regarding the legitimacy of mail-in ballots, and we are also seeing some court cases as well. But I just wanted to hop on, give that little update. I hope you guys are all doing well and taking care of yourselves this week. Thanks, everyone. We have seen a few states flip. According to the New York Times, the battleground states to watch were Michigan, Wisconsin, Florida, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Nevada, and a few more. Before we dive into the results from these states, it's important to note that different media sources and networks have called or projected the winner at different times, and that recounts and additional ballots may alter the results between now and when you're listening to this podcast. As of today, Friday the 6th, here is what we know as reported by the New York Times. First, in the battleground states are Michigan and Wisconsin, which had similar patterns in terms of how the outcomes shifted. Early on November 3rd, Trump was leading in both states, but by the end of the day, Joe Biden had pulled ahead, and it is projected that he has won Wisconsin by a 1% margin and Michigan by a 3% margin. These were battleground states, and both Wisconsin and Michigan were won by Donald Trump in the 2016 election. Florida was another battleground state, as well as Texas, and the Biden-Harris campaign was hoping to flip each of these states blue, but in both states, it is projected that Trump has won them. Arizona is also interesting because as of today, AP and Fox have called Arizona for Joe Biden, but Times and CNN have not called. There are some votes that still need to be counted, and the margin is pretty small, so some media sources are waiting to call that. As of today, Georgia flipped in Biden's favor early this morning, early on November 6th, and it is a very close race, and because of that, there will be recounts in Georgia, and we are likely to see recounts in Wisconsin and a few other states with very close margins as well. Additionally, Pennsylvania has flipped in Joe Biden's favor as of today, but they still have more ballots to count. And as of today as well, in Nevada, Joe Biden is still in the lead. So while there's a lot we don't know nationwide, we do have a clearer picture of what's going on in Washington state, and I will turn it over to Adah to talk about those results.
Yeah, and just to touch on something you said, Anna Corinne, we were both involved, both Anna Corinne and I and the rest of our office, in doing our first hub, which is like student activation voting network on campus. And this was mandated by our governor, who just got elected for his third term, Jay Inslee, last year. And so all college campuses had to have some sort of voter hub to help students, especially as there are transient populations. Students normally vote less. So that was really exciting. And I also know that on our mind was we were worried about protesters and this year being special and luckily we didn't have protesters or any. It felt like a very smooth process. Everyone was happy to have another location to vote in, and my heart goes out to all of the voting locations that and people that are working in the polls who are potentially in danger with the protests going on outside of them. And without further ado, I will continue talking about some interesting results that we have so far from Washington State. Most races, most of the information is fairly set in stone at this point, but there are some races that are still a little bit close. So one of the most interesting things that came out of this election is that we had 60% of the Washington State vote for referendum 90, which is the first sex ed requirement for public schools in the United States. And this is basically allowing Senate Bill 5395 to take effect, thereby requiring public schools to provide comprehensive sex ed education for all students and requiring students to be excused if requested by their parents. And so this would be beginning in the 2021-2022 school year, grades 6 through 12 for all public school students, including those in grades K through 5, beginning in 2022-2023 school year. So there's a little bit of a different rollout rate for the K through 5 year, but this will be coming into effect really soon. Under the bill, the curriculum that's included includes instruction and information regarding affirmative consent, bystander training. Instruction needs to be provided at least once for students in grades K through 3, once for students in grades 4 through 5, twice for students in grades 6 through 8, and twice for students in grades 9 through 12. And then the material specifically for the grades K through 3 is designed around social and emotional learning. And it's a process through which individuals build awareness and skills in imagining emotions, setting goals, and establishing relationships, making responsible decisions that support success in school and in life. And then schools are obviously required to notify parents of what's going to be within that comprehensive sex ed education, and thereby parents are able to excuse their students if they don't want their kids learning that information. But it's really cool that this passed by such a large margin in Washington State. It was definitely a very contested issue within the state. In other news, around 93% of expected voters have been counted so far. We have a clear victory for Biden at 60%. Governor Jay Inslee, like I mentioned before, is going into his third term. And then information from the 40th and 42nd district, we have Susan Del Bene with 59% moving on to the State House of Representatives, and Rick Larson with a percentage of 65%. And then we also had 3 Republicans and 5 Democrats move on to the House in general. Some interesting, exciting news from Whatcom County. We had 86.75 voter percent turnout, and there's only 249 ballots left to count. And then those results will be certified on the 24th this month. It's looking like Denny Heck will be our next lieutenant governor, and Kim Wyman, who's our incumbent Secretary of State, has a slim lead over Gail Tarleton. And that's the main news from Washington State.
Thank you for tuning in to our executive order this week.
We'll be taking a bit of a break from what has been an absolute emotional roller coaster this election. And then when we're going to come back, we're going to talk less about elections and voting and more about broadly what you can do to get yourself civically involved. We've definitely been focusing a lot the last 6 episodes on all of these things because they've been at the top of our agenda, but there's so much more that you can do. So I just hope that you give yourself a break over the next week. I know this election has caused a huge toll on our emotional and physical well-being. And I hope you're excited for our new content over the next 6 weeks once we come back. So this has been our executive order with Adah
and Anna Corinne.